All right, everybody, Parashat Vayishlach. And Maaseh Dina is obviously a tough topic. Um, and the fact that actually the essay doesn't really doesn't focus on the rape or abuse of Dina itself doesn't wind up making it that much better, as we'll see. I thought at some level it would be interesting to see how a contemporary female and feminist Torah scholar, engages with this story, and not obviously wanting to essentialize those dimensions of her identity, but when I saw this topic, I was in some way a little bit particularly drawn to it, given that we're reading Rabbanit Dr. Michal Tukachinsky, and I think it is really fascinating, the angle of focus that she takes and how she attempts to read charitably, in a certain dimension, not obviously the actions of Shrem, but the way the Chachamim kind of cast this, acknowledges the difficulties of it and engages with it. So let me share my screen. Okay, Maaseh Dina, the event, kind of a little bit euphemistic, regarding Dina. The sad story of Dina and the pall that this story casts over the house of Yaakov give birth to Molidim, kind of spawn, maybe is the best translation, spawn, a broad kind of involvement of the commentaries surrounding the question of how did it happen, what could have led to such a thing. The questions sort of splinter out into different directions. How could this have happened to Yaakov, our patriarch, this righteous person who was promised that he would be particularly protected? How did it happen to Dina, Yaakov's daughter? How could it happen to this honorable family? How could Shrem have allowed himself to behave in the way in which he behaved? And more, right? So there's a lot of different overlapping but different questions that are subsets of the question, how could this happen, right? Regarding the particular actors, victims, other parties to the event. Here we want to kind of follow and track two approaches that particularly pertain to Dina alone. And already we see, I think, something somewhat consistent, which is the kind of two approaches, a brisker derech kind of analysis, two ways of understanding the story, different two primary kind of motivations for the events. So she starts out by quoting Avot Rabbi Natan, quoting a pasuk. I believe it's a pasuk from Mishlei. The person who digs a pit will fall in it. And then the second half of the pasuk, she will quote in the next paragraph, is Poretz geder yishachenu nachash. The person who breaches a fence will be bitten by a snake. So that's the pasuk which is quoted in this midrash. And then the midrash says this refers to Dina, the daughter of Leah, whose brothers and father's house were sitting and studying in the Beit Midrash, and she went out to see, to socialize with the women of the land, the locals. As it says, Vateitze Dina bat Leah, Dina, the daughter of Leah, went out. And who was the snake that bit her, right? This is now having said that a person who breaches a fence will be bitten by a snake. That is Dina. She's the one who breaches the fence. Who is the snake that bit her? That is Shrem ben Chamor, who abused or raped her. This paragraph from Avot Rabbi Natan describes the picture of life that preceded the event. Right? What's the scene, most narrowly and more broadly? What's the general family kind of dynamic or behavior that was happening in the context, or in the context of which this event took place. The whole family of Yaakov and his sons are sitting and learning in the Beit HaMidrash, in the study hall. Outside of that picture remains only Dinah, the young daughter who doesn't have a place in the Beit HaMidrash and is also not being overseen by any ish, and I think here maybe particularly we want to say not just any person, but by any man, because everybody, practically speaking, is busy. So Dinah goes out to occupy herself, and she gets bitten by this devious snake. She falls like easy prey into the hands of Shem ben Chamor. Indeed, this drasha is based on the pasuk Poretz Geder Yishachenu Nachash. Somebody who breaches a fence will be bitten by a snake, or a snake will bite them. And it hints thus to the idea that Dinah is guilty because she breached the fence. But it seems like this reading is not unequivocal, is not the only necessary reading. It's possible to read this pasuk in this context, not as an application or a kind of a casting of guilt, and as a kind of arrangement of a sequence of sin and punishment, but rather as a factual description. She burst through the fence, she went out, and she was bitten. Somebody, the person who really tries might even be able to hear the composers is not exactly the right word, of Prokofiev playing in the background. The story of maybe the symphony of Prokofiev playing in the background. In the story of Peter and the Wolf, right, the one who's guilty is the one who didn't close the gate. According to this, if there is any guilt in this story, then it actually is laid at the doorstep of Yaakov and his sons, the ones who are occupied in the Beit Midrash and didn't remember to pay attention to their young daughter, young sister, and in so doing, caused her harm. They are found in the ivory tower, Migdal Hashen, and they have abandoned the responsibility to protect their sister. Right. So this is, I think, a really interesting two different readings of this midrash. One, the person who breaches a fence gets bitten by a snake. You're supposed to stay inside, and if you burst out, you're doing the wrong thing, and you get punished as a result. Dinah was supposed to, be in an enclosed environment. She did the wrong thing by going out, and she gets punished as a result. And Rabbanit Dr. Tikachinsky doesn't take a stance about that reading, just says, you don't have to read it that way. You can actually read it that it's describing a reality. That, she went out and she got bitten. And when you look at that situation, you ask yourself, well, who was responsible for keeping the gate closed and ensuring security? It was Yaakov and his brothers. And here's where I think the most interesting sort of critique is the equating of the Beit Midrash to the ivory tower, the idea that somehow being immersed in Torah study can become a thing which blinds you to responsibilities outside and family responsibilities. And therefore, she says, if there's any blame, then the blame is in this reading, is on Yaakov and his family for not having noticed that they weren't paying attention to Dinah, and they, left the gate open, so to speak. So this is reading number one, with its sort of two dimensions. In the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah, there is a reverse, an opposite criticism of Yaakov, right? So if the criticism of Yaakov here is inattentiveness and lack of oversight that makes Dinah exposed to harm, now we're going to see the opposite. The Dinah Heichanhi, where was Dinah? He had placed her in a box and locked her inside of it, saying, "This Rasha eino ramahi, shelo yitla einav v'yireh ota v'yikach ota mimeni." This wicked one is has a high eye. He's got a kind of a gluttonous eye. Let him not lay his eyes on Dinah, see her, and take her from me. Marlo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said, you weren't willing to marry her off in the kind of an acceptable way, and now she's going to be married off in a prohibited way. Because you sort of were overprotective and didn't see to it that she partnered up safely. She's going to wind up being partnered off in a prohibited, harmful way. According to this midrash, Yaakov was not negligent in his oversight of Dinah. Rather, the opposite. He was overprotective of her, and when he put her into this container and locked it up at the time of his encounter with Esav. That's the Rasha that the Midrash is talking about. Yaakov, as he was getting ready to encounter Esav, hid Dinah away, overly, lest Esav lay eyes on her and want to marry her. Right, as she says, right, he put her into this box and locked it up at his encounter with Esav, lest Esav desire her, lest his brother desire her and take her. This image of the daughter locked in the box maybe can reflect the nature of the education that Yaakov gave Dinah. The message was that she was some kind of, precious treasure, a gift wrapped up in a box. She should have been protected with I don't know, tzemer geffen, some kind of cotton, some kind of a fluffy, fluffy wrapping, and not exposed her to any foreign eye. This excessive protection and love maybe led to the opposite of what was desired, right? So here the critique of Yaakov is overprotectiveness, which maybe somehow, sheltered Dinah so much, and or shouldn't say sheltered, confined Dinah so much that it sort of drove a rebellion to a kind of breaking out. Again, not one of which the text is looking to particularly criticize Dinah as much as to criticize Yaakov. So we have these two opposite notions: Yaakov being negligent in his inattentiveness, and Yaakov being overprotective. Lumat elu, in contrast to these, in Breshit Rabbah there is a drasha about the creation of the woman of Vayishlach, whose conclusion about Dinah gives the impression that that's what the whole midrash is about. In other words, from the fact that this midrash ends with something that has to do with Dinah, it gives us the indication that the whole purpose or subject of the midrash is to focus on Dinah. Okay, the drasha talks about God's efforts to create the perfect woman, whose measurements are kind of precisely made for the needs of Ha'adam, of the first human. These efforts come to expression in the choice of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to create the woman specifically from the side or rib, different translations, of the Adam. what were the alternatives that stood in front of God in terms of what to create the Isha from? So this is the Midrash says. God was looking and considering, contemplating from whence to create the woman. And God said, I'm not going to create her from the head so that she not be, overly haughty or so kind of, hold on a moment. I'll be right back. Okay, so yes, not from the head so that she not be overly kind of full of herself or heady. Not from the eye so that she not be overly curious. Not from the ear so that she not be, hard to say exactly tzaitanit here. I don't think it means overly like let's say in Hebrew is to kind of heed and listen, but I don't think it means overly obedient. I think it means kind of like a someone gossipy who's looking to hear all different kinds of things. Not from the mouth so that she not be overly chatty. Not from the heart so that she not be overly jealous. Not from the hand so that she not be overly kind of tactile or grabbing things. Not from the leg so that she not be parnasit. I forgot to check that one. See if we can find that. Rather from a modest, partially or entirely concealed part of the Adam. Even when a person is standing naked, the rib is concealed. And then for every individual limb that God was creating in the woman, God would say, be modest, be modest. So again, tremendous amount to think and say about this midrash and its underlying set of assumptions. We're, just journeying through here, and we'll see what Rabbanit Tikachinsky has to say. So, Haisha miyuchelet, the sought after woman that God is trying to create should not be overly curious, shouldn't listen to conversations that are not her domain, shouldn't be a chatterbox, jealous, mess in affairs, grope around in business that isn't hers. And all of this in order that she be tsinua, and however we want to translate that, humble, modest, unassuming. But it didn't work. The continuation of the Midrash describes God's failure. Again, in the same way that sort of turns the tables in the reading of the first Midrash to blame Yaakov, here a fair reading is to say, okay, this was God's approach, but it did not succeed. Even so, it says in Mishlei chapter 1, all of my advices or counsels were kind of failed, disturbed. I didn't create her from the head, and yet she was, haughty, as it says, quoting from Yeshayahu. They went, with uplifted throats. They went sort of proud. They walked. The Israelite women walked about proud, not from the eye, and yet she was curious. Looking around at everything, as it says, curious of eye, there in Yeshayahu, not from the ear. And yet she was listening to everything. As it says in Bereshit 18, Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent. Not from the heart, and yet she was jealous. As it says, Rachel was jealous of her sister. Not from the hand, and yet she had her hand in everything. As it says, Rachel stole the house idols, the trafim. Not from the leg, and yet she was parsanit. Yes, not parnasit, parsanit. Again, somehow getting involved in other affairs, going out into public. Maybe it's a little bit towards promiscuous, as it says, and Dinah went out. Okay, so And again, her contention is that kind of because this is the last cited text in the Midrash, that this is somehow the driving force in the Midrash, which is you don't have to read it that way. Rachel is mentioned twice. There are other dimensions to it, but the culmination seems to be Dinah. It's the last one, and she reads it as the culmination. And in Breshit Rabbah, in another place, it's claimed that despite all of these efforts, all women have these undesirable, evil is how it's written here, qualities, right? Meaning it's not just individual ones possess individual ones, but says the Midrash, there are 4 attributes said about women, sort of gluttonous, listening into everything, lazy, and jealous. And these are, difficult things to read. I don't know what motivated the Chachamim to adopt these perspectives, but I think, it's worth engaging them, seeing that they're there, and looking at how one Talmidat Chachamim attempts to encounter them. There, the proofs of those 4 attributes are from Sarah, Rachel, Miriam, and Leah in this separate midrash, which just this one line is quoted from above. That is to say, even our matriarchs, the righteous ones, the ones, even they did not stand up to the ideal model that God had desired for a woman. Ma mashma'ut hamidrash hazeh. What is the meaning? Yes, okay. Sally has an absolute fair answer. Misogyny. That's hard to deny that possibility. Again, I guess in my studies with Rabbi Linzer over the years, he would always ask the question: something which looks like misogyny, is it androcentrism? Meaning, is it hatred of women, or is it a male-centric perspective? I don't know if that makes it any better. Or if the answer is yes. It's hard to imagine that the Chachamim disliked women, but these midrashim have a critical eye, a critically driven eye towards women. Okay, so what's the meaning of this midrash? It's possible, of course, to hear here a great disappointment and a sense of failure which has no upside. That God gave women all of these, good starting points, and they somehow denied the nature of how they were created. Right? Their point of origin was the correct part of the body for the vision, and instead they went against that and adopted the attributes that reflect all the other things that weren't chosen. And now here's where we get her one moment, I think, of really explicit self-conscious kind of need to reframe, right? Even in the first midrash with Dinah, she doesn't say, but we can't countenance the idea of victim blaming, so we have to read it this other way, which is that it's blaming Yaakov for having left the gate open. She just says there's an alternative reading. Here she says, mitoch hakoshi b'ha'azana l'midrash hazeh, because of the hardship, the difficulty of literally hearing this midrash, I suggest here lahat'in oto, to load onto it, to saddle it almost with mashma'ut chadasha b'chiyuvit, a new and positive meaning. Now, so here, what self-conscious is, it seems that she's not saying, I think a possible reading of this is positive. A possible originally intended reading is positive. She's saying, no, because of how hard it is to hear this midrash, knowing that it means what it says at whatever level, I want to add on to it a new and positive frame, which is Omnam ein eitza ve'ein tevuna, isha hi adam. And I think here she means intentionally Isha hi Adam, right? There's no way to modify, there's no chokhmah that can overcome the reality, which is that woman is Isha is Adam. Woman is Adam, is made out of the same stuff, and therefore is subject to the same flaws and weaknesses and realities. And in so being, she is, curious, listening in, you know, all these different qualities, and included in that is goes out into the public square to encounter people and to make friends. In other words, the attempt to create out of the man a thing which would somehow be different than that man fails because, even if you choose the rib or the side, the essential material is the material of origin, which is all those things that human beings are. And you can't, you can take I guess the way to say it is you could take the woman out of the man, but you can't take the man out of the woman in some sense. When you create that woman from man, then the dimensions of man are in that woman. And that includes the social instinct to go out into community wherever it is and encounter people. Dina goes out to the outside, not because she's not modest, but because she is Adam. And again, I think here she's just intentionally using Adam as, the basic human, the man, and the thing from which she was created. Okay, we're almost done. Hatzah acheret, another suggestion, right? So we've seen this happened to Dinah because Yaakov was negligent. This happened to Dinah because Yaakov was overprotective, and this happened to Dinah because Dinah was a human being and she acted in the normal ways that all human beings and not women as opposed to men act. Another suggestion is ki'ima bita, like mother, so daughter, from the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi here is comparing between Leah, who went out, and Dinah, who went out. That this was a problem in the education, or maybe a innate inclination that she inherited from her mother, either the way nature or nurture, either the way her mother taught her or the way she was, what she inherited genetically from her mother. In any event, or either way, I would choose to explain that the Midrash is pointing to Dinah's actions as a painful mistake that also has a kind of a claim about her lack of naivete and innocence. Just like the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah brings in another place, any woman who goes out into the market, into the public square, will ultimately encounter an obstacle, fail or stumble. How do we know? From Dinah, as it says, and Dinah went forth, and in the end she encountered difficulty. Yes, Sally writes Vayetze Yaakov. That's the alternative origin story. Absolutely. Of course, we don't see that, but I bet it must be found somewhere. We have to search for that. Good. It's possible to claim that these sources constitute an attempt to give some explanation to the events of Dinah, to try and answer the question marks that surround it. But in my opinion, it's also possible to see in all of these kind of ways of relating kind of a post-trauma attitude or way of approaching this horrible incident or event. Anyone who reads this portion, every year anew, is outraged and enraged by the suffering that was caused to Dinah by the Hamas, the wanton violence and the great perversion, and also hurts and closes their eyes from looking at the painful revenge that the brothers carry out. Okay, obviously, lots of unintended but very present thoughts about the current moment. On the one hand, a return to the details of the event and an attempt to kind of really dig into them and understand where the wrongdoing happened. Is it that the parents were too busy? Was it the wrong approach? An absence of adequate preparation of their daughter for the real world, for life. Also casting guilt on the victim and impugning her character or her actions is likely to be part of that kind of response. Right here, she's now trying to say to us, like, let's look at this through the lens of what happens when everybody experiences a trauma. There is the return to the event itself, the desire or the need to somehow find an answer to it, which leads the brain to try anything. Blame the people who influenced or should have been responsible, blame the victim. These are just things that we instinctively go to in order to try to make sense of a horrific event. And we who are kind of exposed to the story dig around together with Dinah into the kind of convoluted or confused dimensions of her personality, into the mistakes that she did, into the absence of caution, and we sort of in so doing, like, document really what we're documenting here or kind of showing here is our actual identification, our kind of decisive and complete identification with Dinah, and our living out together with her this kind of self-implication and the anger that comes as a result. So this is her attempt in this paragraph to kind of, there's an apologetic dimension and there's a kind of a fresh perspective dimension, that almost sort of seeing all of these midrashic explanations not even as things that are supposed to be taken as almost as reasoned responses, but as kind of emotionally driven responses to the inexplicability and the horror of it, which is to kind of cast about throwing blame at anything and everything, and in somehow blaming Dinah. And this is the part which I tried to translate, I'm not even sure I totally understood, which is that somehow in the blaming Dinah, we're identifying with Dinah and we're somehow blaming ourselves. The challenges of Yaakov will continue to, and this is again the moment we often see from her in the very last perspective, the very last paragraph. She tries to kind of bring it all the way to now. The challenges of Yaakov accompany us for yet a long road. Dinah, after this parashah, will disappear entirely. According to one of the midrashim, she gives birth for Shem to Osnat and goes down with her to Mitzrayim. Right, that's the daughter of Potiphar, of Potipharah, who's given over to Yosef as a wife by Paro. So according to one of the midrashim, that's Dinah and Shechem's offspring. And in the end of the story, then she becomes the savta of the sons of Yosef and returns to the embrace of the family, right? The function of that midrash, she's arguing, is to kind of restore Dinah, who otherwise disappears from the scene. But by making her offspring together with Shem be the later wife of Yosef, she's sort of restored into the family fold and into the family story. In the midst of these long, confused journeys, and in the depths of the darkness are hidden these seeds of restoration and redemption that at times, within the trauma itself, are hard to discern. That's also a message we've seen from her kind of inexplicably a few times, the sort of notion that in the darkest moments, the light is born. Here she's sort of saying you can't actually see that at all in this time, but sometimes at a later period that will have been revealed to have been true. So I think, again, we were exposed to some very difficult rabbinic texts about women. I think her reading is exactly as she described it. It's a new reading that reads in a much more positive light, texts that don't feel like they were intended positively, but I think it's a compelling kind of reading. The idea of of kind of denying the differentiation between the woman and the man and just acknowledging all these things as expressions of humanity. And then this attempt to sort of read ultimately kind of in the way that Nechama Leibowitz often spoke about, the notion of if there are many attempts to explain something, clearly none of them are satisfactory. So the kind of 3 or 4 approaches to what could have made the Dinah event possible is a way of saying we can't really countenance, explain, any of them. And this is all a reflection of kind of not even being able to come to a clear-headed way of addressing this horrible situation. Okay, pause for questions, comments, reactions. Dara, please. We don't hear you yet, Dara, but if you want to try, I see you're unmuted, but I don't hear you yet. Maybe try typing into the chat if that's possible for you, or see if you can connect your audio a different way, Dara. Meantime, other comments? Sally?
Yeah, I mean, you can't fix this story. It's a bad story, and the rabbis make it worse. And I don't think she really did much here to improve it. I mean, yes, when you take normal human qualities, which are good in a man, and you say that they're bad in a woman, that's the definition of misogyny.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think she improved the situation. There must be a way to. I would check your Shumi, the women's.
Yes. Great. Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And I think it's a fair pushback on that attempt to reread that midrash, that indeed these are qualities which would be positively viewed in a man, and all she's said is these are the natural behaviors, but she's still criticizing them in the woman in a way that she wouldn't in the man. So I think that's also fair. Yeah. Abadi from Yerushalayim, go for it.
We try something. In response to Sally, so Rashi quotes one of the midrashim that Michal quotes. She quotes the one about the one that you referred to as the victim blaming one, and he only quotes it with the victim blaming part. He doesn't give the alternative reading, which if you read the midrash in its whole, you see that there's also potentially a blame for Yaakov and the brothers for not finding a place for Dinah and not giving her the proper education in a different midrash to handle what happens when you go into the world. So I think there is an attempt to try to make the rabbi's reading, I'm going to use the word better. That's Sally's word. Make it better, or make it easier to reading this parsha with the Rashis is very disturbing. Reading it with the same midrashim but with Michal's interpretation does, in my opinion, make it a little better.
Good, great, yeah. So nothing great to work with, and on the margins, interesting questions of exactly as sort of how do the different interpretations and the selective quoting of them, like we said, make it better or worse, or cast more blame on different parties. Dara wrote
I'll give you,
yeah,
I'll give you one other point.
Yep.
That medrash about Esav, that he didn't allow Esav to see her, where Esav could have, the way Rashi says it, Esav could have been made to be a better person if he would have had the right wife. Why did Yaakov stop? That's how Rashi does it. So the way he does it is not that you're supposed to give your daughters to all the Rishayim to make them better, right? Which is again, I don't think anybody thinks that. So that Rashi is very disturbing. But saying we need to educate our daughters so that they can move their way around into the world, not by hiding them, but by giving them the proper education. That's the way she reads the midrash. Not that you should have given her to Esav, but that you shouldn't have boxed her in a box.
Yes.
So it's very very different than the way Rashi, the way that if you just read the Rashi plain, and I think a lot of people write about that Rashi. They don't understand what to do with that.
Yeah. Well said.
So sorry, you can go. Let's go back to Dara. Sorry.
Yes. So Dara's question was in the opening of the piece, where was Leah? Right. So in that first midrash, which she read in her sort of second reading as critical of the family for all being in the Beit Midrash. Yeah, there's her Leah's place and her possible role, protector or otherwise, or engager with Dinah is absent. It's a good question that I don't know the answer to. How does she fit into that midrash, that narrative? Yeah. Any other comments, Sally? Back to you.
I'm not sure that blaming the mother is better than blaming the victim.
Okay, fair. Yep. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So that leads me to another point, actually. Why blame the victim in the first place? Right. And I think that's maybe behind what Sarah's saying. So it seems to me that there's two issues. One which Michal says, I think, and one that she maybe doesn't say. The one that she says is that we're dealing with Yaakov and a family that we don't expect this kind of thing to happen to, because they're tzaddikim, they're fathers, whatever. We can't imagine that this could be without any comment from the Torah at all. Why such a bad thing should happen to good people, right? That we ask that question all the time. So she's frustrated, or I think the Midrash is frustrated, not to just say, "Oh my God, I can't believe this happened." That man Shechem is such a bad guy. But alternatively, there must be some lesson here. And Sarah's right that in the next question is, okay, so now the lesson turns into victim blaming. But we can't just leave it here. We're just saying that the victim is blameless, and put all the because if you don't blame the victim, if you don't learn some lesson, you're blaming God. Right? You can blame Shechem, but at the end of the day, you're blaming God. So that's one thing. And the other question, which Michal doesn't say, but I think is here, is Maseh Avot Siman Lebanim. Right? There's supposed to be an eternal lesson for this. It's not just enough to say Shechem's a bad guy. Look, that's such a horrible thing to happen to Dean. I can't believe it. So that's why the Midrashim are trying to find lessons. And unfortunately, that's where they're going. But these lessons are supposed to tell us, well, in Michal's reading, how to educate our children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How not to be too restrictive, or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's I think what's a little bit of what's going on here.
Yeah, yeah. I think both good points, and I agree. I agree that we often will prefer to assign a blame than to throw up our hands because the implication is God or just an utter sense of powerlessness. And yet, I think, at least for me, I'd still rather land there than a lot of the stances or ways that this gets played out here. But I think you're absolutely right just to point that to that instinct and I think that's it is what she's saying at some level in those last paragraphs about the kind of post-trauma, moment, which is to just throw around blame because we're so terrorized and what you've added here, like in particular, can't believe this would happen to this family. She doesn't go to that sort of meta place that we are here now of sort of analyzing, what would the better response be, so to speak. Yes, and Dara, just clarifying, as I think I understood you to be saying, this is not in that question. You weren't blaming Leah or Dina, just sort of noticing that in Rabbanita Kaczynski's opening framing, where the accusation is of negligence, there's sort of just this missing piece, which is where was Leah at that moment. That's right. David L. Yep.
I wonder whether or not the search for an explanation is a search undertaken by the powerless. And that if you think about societies that consider themselves powerful and in control of their own destiny, I wonder if that same search for explanation comes about.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes just bad things happen. Sometimes, we don't have the world is a brutal and difficult place, and we don't have a counterparty with whom to resolve the brutal things. It's not our fault. There's nothing we can do. That sounds like the explanation of a society that holds itself in power. Mm-hmm. And certainly for Rashi, the guy who had to keep rewriting his manuscripts because they kept getting burned up by the guys next door. The sense of powerlessness and wanting to believe that there's a justice in the world, that if you just do the right thing, if you just do the things you can control, there won't be suffering or turmoil or destruction or terrible things in the world. That seems to me to be the refuge of the powerless.
That's a good reading, good kind of frame of how to look at the approaches to explanation from the context of the reality of who's making them and what their station is. Yeah, thank you.
That leads me to one other point, which I was thinking when I read the beginning. Thank you, David. The famous poem and reaction of Bialik, who I'm going to argue, according to David, was powerless, felt powerless in the response to Kishinev.
Yeah.
Part of that was to blame the devotion to text and to specific halacha. I think there's a discussion in that poem about the Kohen who couldn't figure out what to do with his wife after she'd been raped. And Bialik is horrified that that's what he's worried about. And that's a reminiscent of the powerless Jew of the ghetto, and that we need to break out of that and fight back and defend our wives and defend our daughters. So I read a little bit of that in Yaakov and the sons being in the big Spanish and ignoring what was going on with Dina, that they needed to take more responsibility for the world around them. I don't think Michal actually says that, but when I read the Midrash, I saw it and I thought that that might resonate, especially after what David said about the powerlessness versus powerful, versus people who feel that they're more in control.
Yeah, very interesting. Micha Goodman really focused on that poem when he talked to our rabbinic mission group about kind of this shift from powerlessness to power, and how October 7th, was a return to that moment and what that leads to in the wake of it. So that certainly resonates very much. Yeah, thank you. Bracha, please.
What the connection is between Yaakov having purchased land from where is it? 1 minute.
Are you thinking about Abraham buying Marata Machpelah?
Talking about Yaakov right before this, having.
Oh yeah, the very end of the
land
previous
from
chapter.
Hamor, Shechem's father.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, we can look at that. Hold on, let me share that on my screen. Right, Yaakov arrives in the city of Shechem, encamps at the entrance to the city. It says, "Vayiken et chelkat hasadeh asher nata shama lo miyad b'nei Chamor avi Shechem b'mea kasita." He purchases this parcel of land, set up an altar, right, and then it's Vatetzei, somehow connected to that. I don't remember if the commentaries try to link, right? It would certainly feel like ripe for a smichut parshiot, although I don't know exactly what it would be. Kind of feel like this is a place to go to Rav Meidan. Somehow he would say something here. I can't remember. We did study some of his take on this, and I don't have it at my fingertips. But yeah, do you want to speculate about a connection, Bracha?
I don't know. Maybe that he's paying money for it. It's almost like ingratiating himself to them. And maybe this wasn't the right time for that.
Okay, interesting. I mean, apropos, I feel like of what we're doing here, it's another dimension of that. Can we find an explanation somehow in the surrounding context, in the relationship between Yaakov and the Bnei Chamor? Interesting.
Later, his reaction to what the sons did was embarrassment. How he's going to look to other people.
So there's something about this entanglement that's connected. Yeah, Abadi, you listen. You're awake at 3-4 a.m. You get to talk as much as you want.
I just don't wake up Yocheved. So my reaction to Bracha's question was am I muted? No. Okay. My reaction to Bracha's question was, there's the Rashi brings the Medrash on Vayeshev Yaakov, Bikesh Yaakov L'Shevet B'Shalva. Yaakov thought that he was done, that he was finished, and God doesn't necessarily have that in mind for people in Olam Hazeh. So Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem. He thought he was done. Rashi even says that, although he doesn't say this. He says that he thought he was done. He was done with Lavan. He was done with Esav. He was wiping his hands and figured, okay, now we can settle. And you're not done. You're never done. That's, I thought maybe based on Bracha's questions, maybe that's a smichut parshiot.
With that sense of shleimut that was elusive or evasive. Yeah, great. All right, shkoach everybody, and tough content, tough to think about the connections to today, and again, the essay got into more tough stuff, but good to wrestle with it together. So thanks everybody. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good rest of your day.